Welcome everyone to this Emancipatory Futures Studies book talk, Navigating the Polycrisis, Mapping the Futures of Capitalism and the Earth by Dr. Michael Albert. The Emancipatory Futures Studies in the Anthropocene is a research project with a critical approach to studying futures. It aims to develop a new knowledge project based on subaltern understandings of emancipatory futures, focusing on the future as temporality in a heating world. The program explores alternative futures that challenge the hegemonic versions of modernity as well as carbon capitalism. The main thrust of the program are ways of thinking about crisis and emancipatory futures in history, utopia and dystopia as modes of thinking and acting on the future, techno-emancipatory futures, decolonizing futures, future pathways through systemic change, and grand ecocentric futures, all centered on the main premise of this world in polycrisis. Today we are joined by Dr. Michael Albert to discuss his wonderful book that just came out. Michael Albert is a lecturer in global environmental politics based at the University of Edinburgh. His research explores the global politics of climate, energy, and food system transformation. And the book that we are going to be talking about is a very timely and important innovation. It's an innovative work of realism and utopianism that analyzes the possible futures of the world system and helps us to imagine how we might transition beyond capitalism. It is noted that the world system of which we are all a part of faces multiple calamities: climate change and mass extinction, energy supply shocks, the economic and existential threats of AI, the chilling rise of far-right populism, and ratcheting geopolitical tensions, to name only a few. In Navigating Polycrisis, Dr. Michael Albert seeks to illuminate how the planetary polycrisis will disrupt the global community in the coming decades and how we can best meet these challenges. Albert argues that we must devote more attention to the study of possible futures and adopt transdisciplinary approaches to do so, to provide a new form of critical futures analysis. He offers a theoretical framework that is going to expand on in this discussion on planetary systems thinking that is informed by complexity theory, world systems theory, and ecological Marxism. Dr. Michael Albert, it's a pleasure to host you on this EFS book talk. You'll have 30 minutes to speak, and then we'll engage with all the participants and open it up for discussion. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you, Charles, for that very kind introduction. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. I'm gonna just share my slides quickly, and then I'll get started. Okay, so I'm gonna start by first talking about this question of future studies and why do we need to study the future in a more systematic way, as the book argues. So why do we need future studies? So future scenario analysis, it's an essential part of political agency. And so what I mean by this, it helps us to reflect on the long-term consequences that follow from our actions today, to be sensitive to risks and uncertainties, and to be prepared to navigate a range of possible scenarios. And it's no surprise that future studies, it's a critical tool that's used by practically all powerful actors in the world today, whether we're looking at governments, corporations, intelligence agencies, militaries, banks, insurance firms, etc. Scenario planning, it's just kind of an integral part of the strategic operations of these powerful actors. And it's even more necessary today in a world of uncertainty and turbulence with multiple intersecting shocks disrupting our global systems. And so just in the same sense that scenario analysis is a critical tool used by these powerful actors, likewise, this should also be true for progressive social movements. who I argue also need to be devoting more energy to the study of possible futures in a polycrisis era. And in particular, I mean, this is not only because we need to be prepared to navigate a range of different scenarios that might happen in the future, but also because we want to be prepared for the kinds of crises and disruptions that are likely going to happen in the next decade and longer. And if we're more prepared for what is likely to happen or the range of possible crises that we will be facing, then we'll be in better position to be able to strategize on how to organize collectively and be able to then take advantage of these crisis conjunctures in order to motivate more progressive transformation. In other words, to motivate a more transformative response to the crises that we're going to face. But to do this, we have to anticipate what is potentially going to arise in the decades to come. And so this motive, this is kind of generally what motivates this book, Navigating the Polycrisis. And so the two core arguments that I make, so as I have just said, first argument, we need more systematic analysis of possible global futures, and particularly from an emancipatory perspective. In other words, not just for any, not just for no reason at all, but because we want to transform the world system in a more progressive and egalitarian direction. And to be able to strategize on how to do that, some form of systemic futures analysis is critical. And then the second core argument, that if we're going to do this well, if we're going to do an effective global futures analysis, we need a transdisciplinary approach that illuminates the feedbacks between the multiple crises that we face. So we can't just look at the climate crisis or the crisis of capitalism or the links between the crises of climate and capitalism. We need to investigate a much wider range of problems that kind of constitute what I call the planetary problematic, or that constitute kind of the key causal forces that will shape the future. And so this is basically what I mean by the planetary polycrisis. And so this term polycrisis has become more common over the past year. And so basically, in the way I use this term, it refers to a convergence of political, economic, climate, energy, food, public health, and global security crises that is more dangerous than the sum of its parts. And so the idea that all these crises, all these problems are entangled through complex webs of relations and feedbacks. And so we have to look at it holistically in order to understand how the future may evolve. So I'll now spend a couple minutes to situate my approach in relation to some other approaches that have also looked at the future and tried to map out possible futures. So in the book, I broadly distinguish between three broad sets of approaches in futures studies, which we can call quantitative, qualitative, and critical. So the quantitative approaches, this is most common among scientists, especially climate scientists and energy researchers. And so these are basically studies that use computational models to project a range of quantifiable scenarios. And so, of course, these kinds of climate scenarios using climate models are central to the work of the IPCC in forecasting a range of possible futures for emissions and global temperatures. This was also the basis of the famous limits to growth study using a systems dynamics model. And today there's a much wider range of integrated assessment models that are used to try and understand how climate, political economy, energy, and land use systems may co-evolve, and to project a range of possible scenarios. A second set of approaches are qualitative scenarios. And so these are approaches that go beyond linear modeling in order to explore a wider range of what-if scenarios, including possible discontinuities and surprise events. And so
Sorry, Michael.
Yes.
Sorry for cutting you mid-sentence. I think you said you were sharing your slides. I'm not sure if you're sharing yet, but we can't see them on our side.
Oh, are my slides not visible?
Yes, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Maybe try resharing again. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll try. I don't know why that didn't go through, but here, are they visible now?
They are visible now. Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Here, let me just get up to speed here where I was. Okay, so yeah, so going through the different approaches to possible futures. So qualitative scenarios, as I just mentioned. So the global trends reports that are done by the National Intelligence Council, which is kind of a consortium of national intelligence agencies in the United States. So they do these kinds of qualitative scenarios. They prepare these reports every 4 years with a new when there's a new American presidential administration. And so the idea is to kind of understand how might the future evolve and how can the current U.S. administration prepare to navigate a range of possible futures. And so these kind of qualitative scenario approaches, in many ways, they're less methodologically rigorous compared to modeling because they rely more on imagination, more on intuition, and thus they're prone to bias in various ways that models might, at least in theory, be able to avoid. But at the same time, they're also better equipped to deal with complexity and uncertainty in the real world because they're able to capture various kinds of feedbacks, power relations, and discontinuities that you can't really capture well within a quantitative model. And so a variant of qualitative scenarios, which is kind of more where my approach is situated, can be called critical future studies. And so this is a variant of qualitative scenario mapping that explores possible futures with the aim of critiquing the present world and imagining concrete utopias. So in other words, how do we map out the future with the intention of trying to transform it or steer the future, shape it in more progressive or utopian directions. And the idea of concrete utopia here is that we're not necessarily seeking we're not seeking a perfect world, but we're trying to seek a plausible future that is much better, more egalitarian, more just, more sustainable than the present, but not necessarily one in which all forms of conflict or injustice have been eradicated. And so these two books here on the right, Journey to Earthland by Paul Raskin and Climate Leviathan by Jeff Mann and Joel Wainwright, these are two good examples of critical future studies that I engage with in the book, but that I also engage with them critically. And so my approach, as I said, it can be situated primarily as a form of critical future studies, but it's one that combines insights from complexity theory, Marxism, ecological economics, earth system science, and other disciplines. And so I argue in the book that some of the other approaches to critical future studies that have been done to date, such as Climate Leviathan, they're not sufficiently transdisciplinary. They haven't drawn sufficiently on insights from integrated assessment models, from the earth system sciences, or from the other disciplines. And so they haven't given kind of a sufficiently holistic analysis of the polycrisis, of the crises that we face and their interactions. And so this is what I try to do in order to kind of create a more transdisciplinary approach to futures thinking than what has been done so far. Okay, so now I'm going to talk kind of broadly about the book's methodological orientation. And so I put methodology in scare quotes here because most hardcore social scientists wouldn't really think of this as a methodology. But just to kind of describe, so like how in a polycrisis era, when we're facing this incredibly complex set of challenges, how do we try and think about global crises while trying to, coherently link our analysis of all these different problems? And so the approach that I develop, in some ways, I consider it a qualitative and critical theory informed variant of systems dynamics modeling. And so systems dynamics modeling, this is the kind of approach that informed the limits to growth study. And so the basic idea is that you want to map out the feedback loops between all the different systems and all the different crises that compose our planetary predicament. And so you need to combine knowledge from many different disciplines in order to understand both these crises or these problems individually, and then more importantly, to understand them as a whole, or to understand how they intersect and form a problematic that is more than the sum of its parts. And so now let me kind of go through some of the steps here that I follow in the book in order to sort of develop my analysis of both the polycrisis and its possible futures. So step one, of course, we need to identify the most relevant processes or the key variables that will shape the future. And so in this diagram here on the right, I've kind of listed out many of the key crises or the key problems that I talk about in the book. And so I broadly distinguish, I kind of analytically distinguish these problems into kind of three main sets of problems. So you have the socio-ecological problematic on one side, which refers to the crises of socio-ecological reproduction, from climate change and the crisis of capitalism to energy and food crises and escalating pandemic risk. And then on the other side, you have the violence problematic, and this particularly refers to the problems of violence, both interstate violence through geopolitical conflict and war, but also domestic violence, which is both perpetrated by states against their own people, so through policing and surveillance, but also through forms of violence from below that often called terrorism or crime. And I look at how that intersects with emerging technological risks in the areas of biosecurity, cybersecurity, and nuclear weapons. And then on the bottom, the existential problematic, this refers to the problems of kind of meaning and identity, and which are shaped by problems like racism, nationalism, gender, hypermasculinity. And I look at how, identity crises or, crises in predominant modes of identity and meaning can also intersect with all the other crises. So this is just kind of a very simple sketch of kind of some of the key problems that I integrate in my analysis of the planetary problematic or polycrisis. And so the second step is then to analyze the interdependencies and feedbacks between all these different processes. And so I'm not going to go through all these feedbacks. Obviously, this is a massively complex set of relationships. And so in chapters 4 and 5 in the book, I kind of go through many of these key relationships, such as, how will the Earth system crisis feedback on the crisis of capitalism, by increasing inflation through rising prices for agricultural commodities, also potentially disrupting financial systems because of crises in the insurance sector as more swaths of property in certain vulnerable regions become uninsurable. So I mean, that's just kind of one small example of the way in which these crises are linked together. And so I don't claim to give an exhaustive analysis of every feedback here, but I focus on some of the ones that I think are going to be most important or most salient in shaping the future. And so the step 3, once we have kind of a rough sense of how do all these different problems intersect and shape each other, then we can imaginatively construct a series of scenarios and that follow different what-if questions. And so an example of this is to ask, what if the neoliberal world order remains hegemonic? Basically a business as usual scenario. What if we continue on a business as usual trajectory? And at the same time, what if we only see incremental technological innovation? Because right now, global elites are hoping that innovations in technology and renewable energy, nuclear energy, energy storage, green hydrogen, electric vehicles, they're hoping that these kind of technological innovations are going to enable global capital to solve many of these problems in the Earth system. And so we need to ask, what if we continue to have this business as usual approach in the global economy, and we only see incremental technological innovation? On the other hand, we could ask another what-if question. So then what if there's a counter-hegemonic bloc that pursues a global green Keynesian transition, or a more regulated form of capitalism that bolsters investment and innovation in green technologies? And so then the idea is that then we kind of try to then imagine, okay, then how might these parameters unfold in this scenario? Would this be able to successfully resolve these crises, or would they maybe address some problems, like maybe address the climate crisis, but then worsen some other problems? And so I'll talk about that a bit in the next slide. So the idea here is to kind of ask different what-if questions to then explore combinatorial possibilities of how these different problems might evolve in the future. And then step 4, I'm not going to talk about this too much today, but we want to identify potential shocks that could trigger bifurcation events. In other words, we want to imagine, let's say we remain on something like a business as usual trajectory. We want to imagine what kinds of crises might happen that could then disrupt this trajectory. And so, for instance, there might be another energy shock that disrupts the world economy. And then we'd also want to analyze how then, if there's an energy shock, say in the fossil fuel sector, like there was with the Russian invasion Ukraine, then how would this then intersect with these other areas to kind of cascade and create a polycrisis cascade, in the sense of, you have a trigger in one subsystem that then cascades across some of these other issues. So like a energy crisis then provoking rising food prices, for instance, so triggering a food price crisis, and then leading to a general problem of inflation, which then leads to a crisis of capitalism, a recession. And then this might have then complex cascading impacts on other problems, like on climate change, in terms of how it will shape, depending on what policies are adopted, that will shape how the climate crisis unfolds, for better or worse. It could lead to more progressive policies, or policies that reinforce fossil fuel extraction. And so the idea here is to then kind of imagine what kinds of crises might happen, how would a shock in one particular subsystem, how would it then cascade across the other subsystems with which it is linked, and then what would be some of the possible policy responses to this conjuncture. And then, because then depending on whatever policy response predominates, then this will set up the kind of subsequent trajectory. And then, we can then see from there, okay, then if this policy response is adopted, then we will likely continue to see these trends unfold after the crisis. So let me talk a bit more about kind of now how I sort of translate that sort of general kind of methodological orientation into thinking about possible futures. So here I have this very simplified map of the possibility space. And so this gives a rough sense of sort of how I think about the future and what I think some of the main possible scenarios are. In the book, I give a bit more of a complex diagram. So in the book, I talk about 7 main scenarios, but here I break them down into 3. But then my point being that there's different variants of each of these possible futures that we can imagine. And so the first is collapse. And so as you can see, if this business, and so this is by no means an original argument, this is a very common argument, but my basic argument here, if we continue on something like a business as usual trajectory, where kind of the neoliberal configuration of the global economy, one in which, short-term profitability, the power of finance capital to kind of constrain state spending within very restricted parameters that, primarily prioritize short-term profits for banks and shareholders, then this is likely eventually going to take us down a collapse trajectory. And so by collapse, I basically mean a geographically uneven breakdown of global economic integration, living standards, and population levels. And so I argue here that we are likely to confront, I think this is less likely today than it was a year or 2 ago. I think it's possible that we will confront another major fossil fuel crisis in the sense of a supply shock sometime around 2030, possibly before or after. And I argue this because we're seeing a major shift in the sense of the depletion of the most easily accessible oil, and a shift to more expensive, more diffuse, unconventional oil sources that are more expensive and harder to extract. And so for example, shale oil and gas, tar sands, offshore oil, Arctic oil. And so as we're shifting to these more expensive and diffuse forms of oil, the kind of risks of these energy crises go up. But it depends, again, it depends on how rapidly the world economy shifts away from oil and gas towards renewable energy. And so I argue that the world economy may be shifting away from oil and gas fast enough to avoid a major fossil stagflation crisis, but that this would not necessarily mean that global capitalism will avoid collapse. Because if it solves the fossil fuel crisis through the same kind of strategies that we're seeing today, extracting more oil and gas from the North Sea and basically states relying more on their domestic fossil fuel reserves, then of course this is just going to mean an even worse climate crisis down the road. And so on this, if this kind of trajectory continues, then over time there's going to be worsening climate shocks, and even though a fossil fuel crisis will be avoided, I argue that these climate shocks are going to disrupt electricity grids even more intensely. And so as we shift to a renewable energy world that's basically more dependent on electricity rather than other fossil fuel sources, I mean, that is of course a good thing, but then it will also be vulnerable to new kinds of electricity supply risks, which include climate damages to electricity grids. And so this is going to get worse. At the same time, climate change is going to severely threaten agriculture systems, leading to the risk of synchronous breadbasket failures, where you have the world's major breadbaskets simultaneously experiencing a massive production failure. And then at the same time, we're probably going to be facing escalating pandemic risk. As the Earth system crisis gets worse, this is going to mean there's going to be more opportunities for zoonotic disease spillover events. And so the idea is that all these problems are going to get worse if we remain on this trajectory. And so I think by 2050 or shortly after, at some point this trajectory would be unsustainable. Capitalist growth and accumulation would come to a halt. Economic growth would basically cease, both in the so-called advanced and emerging economies of the world system, and you'd have a kind of crisis of epic proportions, leading to some kind of uneven breakdown of the world system. So that's the collapse scenario. But on the other hand, we could see a scenario in which one of these crises leads green capital to accelerate the renewable energy transition. And so as I show on this diagram here, I argue that if the renewable energy transition accelerates, we're likely going to face, at least temporarily, what I call a greenflation crisis, in the sense that an accelerated shift to renewable energy will likely increase the costs of goods and services in the economy, at least in its early phases. And this is because the renewable energy transition has very high upfront costs. It requires a lot of upfront energy expenditures and financial expenditures. It requires a lot of minerals, transition minerals extracted for lithium, cobalt, copper, and other minerals. And so you would see a major shock likely to prices of these minerals. You could also see a hit to food systems if we have a shift towards more organic agriculture systems that try and internalize more of the costs of agriculture, of food production. Then you temporarily, there's gonna be likely an inflationary hit. And so we're already seeing this to some extent in Europe, which is why we've seen a right-wing populist backlash. And so my general argument is that if there are more policies to accelerate the renewable energy transition, then this will likely lead to, at least temporarily, a greenflation crisis, which then could lead to right-wing populist backlash and then kind of a reversion back to the trajectory of collapse. On the other hand, we could see a scenario in which major technological breakthroughs happen. And so this would be in kind of, for instance, in renewable energy and energy storage technologies, possibly in nuclear energy like nuclear fusion. And so together, these kind of technological breakthroughs could bring down costs and kind of help capital resolve a greenflation crisis, and then create a new wave of green accumulation, or I should say relatively green accumulation. But then this would take us down the trajectory that I call techno-leviathan. And so the idea here is that this would be a world order in which green industrial policies create a greener form of capitalism through rapid technological innovation. But many of these same technological innovations, so for instance in artificial intelligence, in biotechnology, in robotics, would also give rise to unprecedented forms of techno-authoritarian power. And so my argument here is a bit complicated, but the basic idea is that many of these innovations, even if they help solve the climate, or at least help manage the climate crisis and energy and food crises, at the same time, they're going to create a host of new technological risks. And so, for instance, weaponized synthetic biology is a major threat that, many global security analysts are very deeply aware of. But what is less often talked about is how if we rely on these innovations in synthetic biology to try and promote breakthroughs to help deal with environmental crises, so for instance, using synthetic biology for new kinds of biofuels, new forms of kind of basically bioenergy plus carbon capture and storage, also new forms of genetically modified seeds for agriculture. Basically, these same technologies are also going to then enable actors with more malicious intent to kind of use this to create super viruses, or to use CRISPR gene editing technology, for instance, to potentially to create dangerous bioweapons that can have extremely disruptive results, potentially creating a pandemic or a super virus with pandemic potential. So that's just one example. But so the basic idea here is that that these technological innovations are gonna create many new problems, both in empowering non-state actors to basically have access to new kinds of weapons of mass destruction, and perhaps more alarmingly, empowering states with new kinds of unprecedented techno-authoritarian powers using AI, facial and emotion recognition technologies, swarming drones that can police the skies, and potentially even neurotechnologies, technologies that can potentially modify people's thoughts and their moods, and potentially even kind of read thinking, at least in some limited sense. And so again, we can imagine a dystopian horizon of new technological possibilities that I argue would emerge in this scenario. On the other hand, finally, we have the more hopeful scenario, which is eco-socialism. And so this is a world in which alternative political economies constrain markets and capitalist power, so that enhancing social and ecological well-being is the overriding priority. And so I'm just about out of time, so I'm not gonna go into detail on this, but one of my basic arguments in the book is that we need to spend more time thinking about how might we actually get to something like an eco-socialist future. And so there's a lot of really excellent work out there that's kind of sketching out, okay, what would an eco-socialist utopia look like? What are the kinds of democratic planning arrangements that this might involve, and and what policies might help us get there? And what would everyday life feel like in this future? And so I think that these approaches are super important. But I'm a bit more interested in this book in how might we actually get to something like eco-socialism, because there's a huge gulf right now between the power of entrenched interests in our world and the grassroots forces who want some kind of post-capitalist, post-growth future. And so I argue that for this kind of future to be possible, there's going to need to be a really deep and sustained crisis of capitalism. And I think that this could happen in the 2030s and 2040s, especially as the climate crisis intensifies. On the other hand, there might not be such an intensive crisis until after mid-century. And again, this is going to be very geographically uneven. And so there's going to be different opportunities in different parts of the world system. But I kind of simplify things by kind of, analyzing the world system as a whole and thinking about crises on this kind of world system scale. And so I argue that if there's a deep and sustained enough crisis of capitalism, and we have strengthening grassroots movements from below, then this might be able to set up a trajectory in the direction of eco-socialism. And so then in the book, I kind of talk about sort of what are the different possible crisis scenarios that might facilitate that, and how might it happen. And again, I don't claim to give the most persuasive answers on how we get to eco-socialism, because I think this is an incredibly difficult question. But part of the point, I want to try and provoke people to think about it more, to really try and think hard about how we might actually get there, because I think that's one of the key challenges for progressive movements today, to not just rely on kind of wishful utopian speculation, but more concretely to really think hard about how might we overcome the obstacles that separate the current world from the hoped for future. So I'm going to conclude there. I'll just conclude by saying that the future will be messy and full of surprises, but we need a rough map of the possibility space in order to inform political action and strategy in the present. And holistic, transdisciplinary approaches are needed to provide insights into possible futures that are missed by existing approaches. So thank you all for listening. Now I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and having a discussion.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that very powerful presentation. It's now open for discussion. Feel free to post your questions in the chat. You're also welcome to raise your hand and ask a question or raise a comment that you would like to engage with Michael on. Michael, the techno-leviathan and the collapse scenarios are just too dreadful to imagine. The eco-socialism one gives us some hope. My question is around in your analysis of the greenflation crisis. How do you see it playing out in the global north versus in the global south?
Yeah, that's a good question. In the book I don't do enough of that differentiation in terms of how it might play out in the global north versus the global south. Because a lot of this will depend on kind of where different countries are located within green supply chains. And so I think that countries in the global north are likely going to be more vulnerable to this kind of crisis, at least compared to a country like China, which, China controls much of the refining of many of the key minerals that renewable energy technologies are dependent on. They also produce the majority of the world's solar panels and wind turbines and batteries. And so, in a sense, China is potentially in better position to shield itself from some of these cost increases. It could itself face problems from kind of disruptions to domestic manufacturing as a result of increased energy costs and labor market turbulence are caused by worker strikes if there's a more militant labor movement in China. But in the global north context, some of the key kind of drivers I look at are kind of so I talked about the demand for transition metals as this is going to be a driver of rising costs. We're also seeing major labor shortages for in many kind of green sectors. So, for instance, like things like installing heat pumps to help decarbonize building sectors. There's major shortages of skilled labor for many of these sectors. And so I think that's an opportunity for workers, for working class movements. The fact that there are labor shortages in many of these areas, and the fact that rich countries are trying to, they're trying to shift away from dependence on Chinese technologies towards, they're trying to, like through the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, there's incentives to try and produce more solar panels and wind turbines domestically. And so I think that, we can criticize the kind of the sort of, some of the like anti-China components of these policies, but at the same time, I think they create opportunities for domestic workers because there's going to be more dependence on domestic labor, less opportunities for capital to kind of uproot and move their factories overseas. And so, I mean that in a very qualified sense. I mean, capital is still, I think, not necessarily returning to these countries so much as kind of, complexifying their supply chains and sourcing to other countries outside of China. So I think that, the trajectory will be complex, but I think the labor shortages, the transition mineral bottlenecks, I think these are going to be contributors to greenflation. Also, the efforts to shift away from solar panels and batteries made in China towards more domestically manufactured products. This will also be a driver of greenflation. So my argument, if this intersects with massive climate disruptions, this would push up the cost for agricultural goods, for instance, disrupt supply chains, which could impact a wider range of goods. And so the idea is that even though these climate shocks would be, they would have horrible impacts on people, at the same time, if it causes a big enough disruption and kind of motivates more, if it helps to politicize more sectors of the population who are dealing with these cost of living crises, then it might create the conditions that could facilitate a challenge to the capitalist class and kind of the project of green capitalism. It could potentially facilitate a shift in a kind of more progressive Green New Deal type direction. But yeah, in terms of kind of how would this crisis play out differently in other parts of the global South, I think it's a super important question, and I haven't done that analysis, but I think that, that's the kind of analysis we need as kind of a next step in terms of moving beyond these kind of big picture narratives towards more fine-grained analysis of, okay, how might this crisis play out in, say, a South African context or another context? What would be the key vulnerabilities, and then how might the local state respond, and how might working class movements respond? So we would need that kind of fine-grained analysis in different contexts, which I don't do that in the book.
There have been a lot of so-called solutions to the climate crisis that are being thrown around that are technologically based. Some of them are rooted in geoengineering, things like cloud seeding and so on and so forth. How do you see that playing out and engendering what you call the techno-leviathan?
Yeah. So I talk about solar geoengineering as I think that, and on that business as usual trajectory that I talked about, I think that there will definitely or almost certainly be deployment of solar geoengineering at some point in that scenario. I think that at some point, likely, we don't know when, but arguably we're already seeing the early phases of a tipping point cascade where tipping points in the Earth system around kind of methane release from permafrost and other sources are leading to an acceleration of warming beyond what the models anticipate. Whether or not that's already happening, probably not, but it seems like we're potentially getting there. But these kind of worsening, escalating shocks are will motivate broad sectors of the capitalist class to turn to these technologies. And so in the book, I show that it's unlikely to work. There's many reasons why we might be skeptical in the first place, that that even if there is sustained global cooperation to have some kind of solar geoengineering intervention, it's we can question whether whether we can really reliably modify the Earth's climate in the way that these geoengineers think we can. But I argue that we're likely going to be entering a very geopolitically volatile world in which the cooperation that would be necessary to govern and to sustain a solar geoengineering program, it's very unlikely to be sustainable. This would have to be a program that would be sustained over decades. in order to avoid a termination shock. Once you start spraying these sulfides in the atmosphere, then you have to keep it going indefinitely until the emissions come down. Otherwise, if the program terminates, then there's that risk of a major termination shock leading to a spike of global temperatures. And so I argue that in a geopolitically volatile environment, these programs are likely going to be vulnerable to war, to sabotage, cyber attacks, in the sense there's going to be, the actors who do not benefit from these interventions would potentially have an incentive to disrupt these interventions, because the benefits of that solar geoengineering will not be shared equally by any means. And so I think that it would be unlikely to be stable. It would be very unlikely to be sustained for the duration that it would have to be in order to be effective. On the other hand, one could imagine a scenario in which there is kind of more global cooperation and kind of consolidation of elite interests behind governing and maintaining a solar geoengineering program. And like you said, that would be one of the kind of dynamics that leads to this kind of techno-leviathan scenario, or it could be one of the dynamics. And so I think that if we have a trajectory towards more geopolitical volatility and breakdown and war, then solar geoengineering will be ungovernable, and and then it'll just reinforce this trajectory towards collapse. But if we do see elite cooperation to govern solar geoengineering, then this could be one of the dynamics that kind of leads to something like a global techno-leviathan like world order. And so this is kind of similar to the argument that Jeff Mann and Joel Wainwright develop in Climate Leviathan in their book.
Thank you so much, Michael. Comrades, feel free to type your questions in the chat or to raise your hand, and we'll allow you to speak. Michael, you began your discussion with by defining the term polycrisis. And there was a very interesting definition that you brought up as we were talking about the term. And I'd like you just to go back and touch on it. As an activist in the Global South, as a member of the Climate Justice Charter movement, we're always talking about how sometimes our activism is centered on single issues and missing the interconnections of all of these issues. So how essential is the term polycrisis in understanding the current state of affairs, in dealing with capitalism, and in thinking about the future as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wouldn't necessarily argue that everyone needs to adopt the term polycrisis. I think one could use other terms, but I think the basic insight, like you articulated, that the whole of what we face is more than the sum of its parts. That we need to think more holistically and intersectionally about the way in which the climate crisis intersects with these other problems. I think that that's essential, and I think that and so, on the left and the climate justice movement, there's already a very rich, tradition and practice of intersectional analysis, like looking at the intersection between climate change with issues of racial and economic justice, and struggles against patriarchy, struggles against policing. And so there's definitely much of this work already being done to analyze these intersections and to kind of organize across these different movements to create a stronger movement. And so I think the term polycrisis does something a little bit different compared to, say, like an intersectionality lens on climate justice, in the sense that kind of we're looking specifically at the way in which systemic crises can be generated by interactions between crises occurring in different subsystems of the world economy. And so, because a crisis, it's a specific term that refers to, a major disruption in a system that then kind of creates opportunity for systemic change, or kind of a turning point, a potential turning point in a system. And so a polycrisis then refers to the fact that you kind of have multiple of these kind of disruptions happening at the same time in different subsystems in ways that are kind of intersecting and feeding back on each other. And so I think the term is typically used more to kind of, understand that intersection and mutual amplification between crises, which is a little bit different from kind of the intersectional climate justice approach, which is, to say that, the struggles for addressing climate change need to be linked with struggles for economic and racial and gender justice, et cetera. And I think they could inform each other, but I think that like the people doing working on intersectional climate justice, they don't necessarily need to take up the term polycrisis to kind of conceptualize what they're already doing or what they already know about these intersections. But I think the term is helpful for mapping out kind of the systemic vulnerabilities within global capitalism and the ways in which crises in one system can then cascade across these multiple entangled systems, from finance and energy and food to public health, and so causing a more wider disruption. And I think this is helpful not just to, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, I think this is useful to anticipate the kinds of crises that capitalism may face in the coming years, so that then we can strategically organize to try and prepare for these crises, and then present a set of policy proposals, more progressive policy proposals on how we should address them in a way that centers intersectional climate justice.
Thanks, Michael. There's a hand up from Michael Lawrence. Michael, please unmute.
Hi.
Hey, you cut out a bit.
Okay. Just a quick technical note. The chat right now seems to be disabled. So I don't know if you have the ability to sort of unmute the chat. So I'm sure some people might want to ask some questions there. But the question I want to ask, Mike, great presentation, as always, very, very clear and succinctly getting through some very, very complicated issues. But I noticed you mentioned almost in passing that you think the collapse scenario you think it's less likely today than you thought it was, say, a year ago. I'm just really curious as to what sort of adjusted your thinking there and what you think is at play in that change. So thank you very much.
Got it. Yeah, thanks, Mike, and thanks for that note about the chat. So I said that I think a fossil stagflation crisis is less likely compared to what I thought a year or two ago. And so I think that longer term collapse scenario is still very much in the cards and very plausible. Some would say arguably the most likely scenario. I'm a little ambivalent in terms of whether it's something like Techno-Leviathan is more likely than collapse. But I meant that I think the fossil stagflation scenario is a bit less likely. And in part that's because in the past year, there's been such a huge expansion of investment in new oil and gas projects globally that whereas a year ago, we were looking more at a problem of structural underinvestment in new oil and gas supplies. And by structural underinvestment, I mean, of course, from a climate perspective, we want investment to dramatically decline and stop. But in the sense of a structural underinvestment relative to projected demand. And so, a year ago, we had more of a scenario where oil and gas demand is projected to steadily rise, and the investment to provide, to kind of invest in depleting fields and explore and extract oil and gas from new areas of the world in order to meet that rising demand, that the investment wasn't there. But there has been a major boon of investment in the last year because of the record profits sparked by the oil and gas crisis. And so I do still think that a fossil stagflation crisis is possible. I think that the International Energy Agency right now has kind of reduced its projections of kind of when oil and gas demand will peak, and they think that the rapid expansion of electric vehicle uptake, especially in China, is reducing oil demand compared to their projections from a year ago. Others come to more, others, well, I guess for them, optimistic. Like the OPEC countries, obviously not disinterested observers. They're projecting, much higher oil demand by 2030. There's other arguably more objective observers, like I think J.P. Morgan is projecting higher oil demand compared to the IEA scenario. So a lot of it depends on where demand goes and how rapidly the electric vehicle market expands. Because as electric vehicles expand, I mean that's the major kind of trend that is reducing oil demand and thus kind of helping countries cushion the blows of possible shortages in oil in particular. So again, I think it's still open. I think demand pressures for demand could still push oil and gas prices higher than what the the International Energy Agency is anticipating, because there might be rebound effects that they're not accounting for. The expansion of electric vehicles might also hit more headwinds, both for cultural and economic reasons. So we'll see. I mean, I'm not a professional forecaster in that specific market, but based on the developments over the last several months has led me to think like, okay, so it's not as much of a threat as it was when I was, finishing up drafting the book. But I still think the risk is definitely there.
That clarifies, and that sounds quite plausible. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for that question. Thank you, Michael, for that answer. Michael, you talk of strengthening grassroots power towards socialism. Could you elaborate a little further on that, please?
I'll try. So, I mean, I'm not an activist. I mean, I am in certain respects, but I mean, my main kind of expertise is as an analyst of these crises, and not so much as an organizer. And so, my I don't have that much insight on like the strategic question of like how do climate justice movements need to organize to expand their power and capabilities to cause greater disruption in order to win bigger concessions and ultimately force more transformative changes at the policy level. I don't have I don't have anything particularly original to say on that. I mean, I think the need to as we've already talked about, the need to link these struggles together. I mean, to build a mass movement that can coordinate some kind of general strike, or at least more bigger disruptive actions that are sustained. And so I think the latest major wave of climate activism, at least in the global north, which is this is just in Europe and the US, which is just the context I'm most familiar with. This kind of peaked in 2019 with the wave of civil disobedience actions done by Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion and allied movements, and they certainly had impacts on policy, at least in the European context, and in the American context helped elect Biden and helped push Biden further on climate than the movement has been able to push any former Democratic presidents. And so I mean, I think that we're gonna need another kind of wave like that, but at least an order of magnitude larger, in terms of there being more of the population involved in these kind of sustained disruptive mass actions. And they're going to have to be sustained, and they're going to have to be linked to organizations that are kind of that are capable of kind of translating this grassroots action into policy demands that then can be acted on by people in power. And you're going to need people in power, like kind of center left green parties that can be pushed further leftwards. And so, I don't think that there's going to be any revolutionary overthrow of existing capitalist states anytime soon. Later this century, when shit is really hitting the fan, maybe like I leave it open in that kind of longer term future. Like, we don't know what will happen, but certainly in the near term, these state apparatuses are very powerful. But I do think as crises get worse, and if you have this wave of sustained, kind of an order of magnitude larger wave of activism compared to the 2019 wave of climate activism, and you have more and more elites, more and more kind of relatively progressive managers of the system who are kind of realizing, like, in order to maintain system stability and address the climate crisis, we may need to be pushed into more radical measures. And so I think you could see a scenario where there's a convergence between kind of more and more powerful grassroots disruptive movements from below and radicalized crisis management strategies from above that could then begin kind of push the policy space further towards, a more progressive Green New Deal, and then potentially over time, ultimately towards something like eco-socialism. So, I mean, that's obviously that's a tall order. It's not the most likely scenario, but I think it's something we can hope for. It's something we can hope is not necessarily what matters, but organizing to do our best to push the system, to push things as far in that direction as we can go.
And perhaps, Michael, as a final question from me, do you think that when you consider these collapses, do you consider them happening in different places at different time due to the non-linearity of interactions? Let's say, for example, Southern Africa is warming at about twice the global rate of temperature increase. And we may see collapses in earth systems faster than other parts of the world. So do you consider it the same thing with the collapses that's happening in different spaces or at different times?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, collapse, the way I conceptualize it, would definitely be a very uneven process. And, some would say that, collapse in some sense is kind of already a reality for certain countries, looking at Syria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Sudan, and other countries, one could say is already in a state of something like, at least what we in the global north would call collapse. And yeah, different areas are going to be impacted more intensely by climate shocks. Sooner they're going to be hit harder and sooner compared to rich countries, and so that's going to definitely threaten collapse of state capacities and economic collapse more rapidly. I think that one can imagine scenarios in which there is a more synchronized, a relatively globally synchronized collapse event. And so, like, I anticipate that on something like that business as usual trajectory, as I said, there's probably going to be worsening pandemic risk over time, and something like we're likely eventually going to be hit by an even worse pandemic compared to COVID-19, something like an avian influenza pandemic with a higher death rates, and if it has comparable levels of transmissibility, then this could be a true even more catastrophic event. And if it hits at a time when the world, and when most states in the world system as a whole has even weaker resilience, in the sense it's already dealing with a barrage of shocks across climate, energy, food systems, and other kinds of economic stressors, from aging populations and rising healthcare costs and antibiotic resistance and other kinds of worsening problems. And then you throw this unprecedented catastrophic pandemic on top of that, then you might see something more like a globally synchronized collapse event. It would still be uneven, but I think you could imagine events like that. A nuclear war breaking out between, like, the U.S. and China over Taiwan is like another kind of horrifying worst case scenario where you could there could be something that's more globally synchronized. But barring those kinds of extreme events, I think, yeah, it'd be more likely to be a very uneven process that unfolds over decades. And so like with the collapse of the Roman Empire, there's no consensus on, when did the empire collapse? There was the sacking of Rome in, say, 410 in the year 410 BC. But then many will say, yeah, but then there was a recovery, and it wasn't really until later in the century that we can say that the Western Roman Empire really collapsed. But then the Eastern half of the empire survived. So, I mean, in a similar sense, it would be really messy when we're talking about a collapse of the contemporary world system. It would be a very messy, uneven process. And if you had future historians looking back on it, then they would debate it and kind of say, like, when did the collapse start? Like, it started in 2008 with the financial crisis. And other people would say, no, it didn't really start until 2050, et cetera. So, I mean, I'm getting a bit off topic. But the point being that, to call the process would be so complex and uneven that, yeah, it's possible for future historians to look back on it with different interpretations.
Michael, thank you so much for making the time to talk to us about your wonderful book. Thanks to all the attendees who came. But just before we close, Michael, I think there's a hand from Connor.
Yeah, do we still have time for another quick one? Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks to the organizers for putting this together. Be really great to hear what you've been working on, Michael. I did miss the start of the talk as I wasn't able to join earlier. So sorry if you covered what I'm about to ask about during it. I just wanted to pick up again on the what is it, the sort of solar geoengineering project stuff
Yeah.
that you mentioned. This is intriguing. And maybe you did discuss it, but I wondered what something like that, a project like that, are there any projections as to, and this was maybe a little bit of a technical question, but kind of how that would impact what the wavelength spectrum that would actually reach the Earth if you had this sort of solar geoengineering project which blocked out sunlight. And this is potentially, for me, I mean, you don't have to need a specific answer for this, obviously, but the doom scenario here is that the sun is the source of life on Earth, right? So I'm thinking about the impact on ecosystems, photosynthesis, and indeed human health as well, generally, given that we're, to an extent, at least when we're up in Scotland in this 56th latitude, we're deprived of sunlight anyway. And so
yeah, it'd be pretty rough for us up here if they're dimming the.
Pretty rough up here.
Yeah.
So I just wonder about has anything like that come up in the literature? Because I do wonder, I guess my view is that we're chronically deprived of good sunlight anyway, so this could make it worse. And then, okay, I did have a follow-up question, which was more political.
I'm probably better at answering the more political one.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, yeah, that one was a bit technical, but the political one was, I guess, I mean, I noticed that you use a lot of like systems theories approach, maybe eco-Marxist approaches, and this is just from a quick glance, so apologies if I'm getting the terminology wrong. But I wonder how the sort of approach that you offer, this eco-socialist approach, matches up to something like a Stiglerian approach, where this is in terms of like just to give a quick sentence on it, where the idea would be to create new economic contexts where what we valorize and reward is the positive externalities rather than contribution to profit or capital accumulation, where we create new economic incentives where we valorize, say, production of ecological benefits and things like this. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, because I know it's someone you've thought about, but I know he's not in the book so much. So just to sort of contextualize it there would be really interesting. Okay, I'll shut my mouth now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Connor, for the question. Yeah, on the solar geoengineering question, I'm not deeply versed in the technical literature on this. I mean, I know there's a lot of modeling studies being done to try and anticipate kind of the impacts on that different degrees of solar radiation management would have on I mean, the climate system and the kind of the broader ecological impacts of that. So I don't know. I haven't read anything about the impacts being anticipated to be particularly catastrophic for nature in terms of like photosynthetic capabilities for the plant world. But I mean, I also know that it's projected that at a certain point, I mean, the sky could become basically clouded and white, and basically there'd be no blue skies anymore. And so I think that clearly there'd be a diminution of sunlight for much of the world's biodiversity. And so in terms of what would be the impacts of that, I mean, obviously on mental health for us, that would be, you know, I mean, I can't imagine a world without blue sky, and the impacts on nature would probably also be incredibly disruptive. But I don't know in terms of like the specific modeling studies that have been done to try and kind of get more detailed insights into that. And I'd have to think more about the Stiegler question, because I mean, from what I haven't read Stiegler's critique of political economy in a while, and there's definitely parallels, like what you say. I mean, the idea of, you know, eco-socialism in the broadest general sense is that, you know, you have democratic planning to create use values in the sense of, you know, basically people coming together to decide what needs to be produced and for what ends. That rather than, you know, profit and accumulation being the driving force of economic decision making. And so I think there's a connection there to what kind of Stiegler is suggesting. But I think from what I remember that Stiegler's also, you know, he doesn't have as much of a structuralist analysis of capitalist power in terms of determining the incentive structures. He seems to kind of almost think that you could kind of have a cultural revolution of a kind in which capitalists would kind of become more willing to, you know, sort of change the incentive structures to invest more in other things rather than just kind of purely for profit, following profit motives. And so I think that I mean, my approach would be more traditionally Marxist in the sense that there would have to be a very clear antagonism and challenge to the capitalist class that would have to happen for the scenario to work, which I don't know if Stiegler would agree with that. But again, I'd have to look at that again to kind of confirm. But that's my, I'll just kind of leave it there in terms of my thoughts. But it's something that, yeah, I'm starting to turn to Stiegler again for another project that that I'm kind of starting. So yeah, it's something that I'll have to look into.
Thank you very much, Michael. Michael Lawrence, is that an old hand or a new one? I think it was an old hand. Michael, thank you so much for making the time to come and talk to us about your book. We really appreciated it. A big thanks to the Emancipatory Futures Studies for organizing this. A big thanks to Professor Vishwas Sadka, who is the principal investigator of the Emancipatory Futures Studies. Michael, thank you again, and thanks to everyone who came to attend. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thanks, Charles, and thanks, everyone.